Okay, now we're going to talk about cutting styles. First off, we have flat faceting. This is the most common cutting style. It's been done for centuries. It gives good scintillation. A factor about flat faceting is, especially gems with a lot of facets, as you move the gemstone, the light dances around, and that is called scintillation. Flat faceting gives very good scintillation if the cut design is good and the cutting quality is good. They can be very brilliant, once again, depending upon cut quality, but flat faceting can be very brilliant. And it can be a classic look, like the gems on the left. They're relatively classic looks. Or it can be avant-garde. You know, it can have frosted facets, like this frosty snowflake, or this cut, which I call the supernova cut. Sort of looks like going into warp or something. Or a honeycomb cut, like these. These are all different cut styles I've done. So it can be very classic, or it can be quite adventuresome, depending upon the cut design. It is also often combined with other styles of faceting. Many times you're buying a concave faceted stone, but often half or more of that concave faceted stone will have flat facets on it. So then we get to concave faceting. Concave faceting is a relatively recent cutting innovation, or at least it became quite popular recently. The patent for the first commercially produced concave faceting machine was given somewhere around 1990, and since then it became more and more popular. Why did it become more and more popular? It's because of the contrast pattern, and the appearance and the great brilliance is one of the main reasons. This blue topaz up top is a very good example of that contrast pattern. You get light and dark and medium tones, and it just looks amazingly brilliant. If you set a flat faceted stone and a concave faceted stone one beside the other and stay still and look at them, almost every time people will say that the concave faceted one looks brighter. It also has a little bit improved tilt brilliance over a flat faceted stone. Because the facets are actually curved, that means that the very top is at the angle chosen by the cutter. But as you travel down the curvature, it's at a deeper angle. So that means as the gem is tilted, you have a little bit more leeway in tilting before it windows. However, there are people who tell me, I just don't like them. And I always wondered why that was, but I finally pinned it down that at least 90% of the people who don't like a concave faceted gemstone, it's because they're feeling the lack of scintillation. Because a concave facet is curved, it distributes the light through the gemstone very evenly. And that means that as you turn the stone, it doesn't change in appearance very much. It's more of what I call a static brilliance. Whereas a flat faceted stone with a lot of facets will wink and dance and do all this kind of stuff. Now you can do some tricks with concave faceting to give it a little bit more of that, but it'll never have the scintillation of a flat faceted stone. And that is often what certain people do not like about concave faceted gems. Another benefit of concave faceting is that it's really good for long gems. Tourmaline and certain other gems often come in long crystals. And with a flat facet, because you have a minimum angle, if you want to put a lot of facets and give it some excitement, not just a standard emerald cut, you have to curve your facets outward. And that results when you have the longer your gem, if you want a radiant style with flat faceting, the deeper your gem gets, and it becomes impractical quickly as the gem gets longer. But because a concave facet is sculpted inward, you can sculpt it inward and inward and inward and inward progressively without having to bow the whole pavilion upwards, which means that you can have a gem that is brilliant and looks sort of like a radiant style without being nearly as deep due to the concave facets. So that's a benefit of concave faceting. Another benefit of concave faceting is that you can do really cool outlines. This green one is one of the few that we didn't cut ourselves here. You can see these concaves in the girdles give many opportunities for unique shapes, and these are just a few. There are hundreds or thousands of different things that can be done with concaves in the girdle or in the crown. And that is also from a cutter's perspective and from a jewelry designer's perspective, that can be fun. One thing I didn't have in my PowerPoint here is that another thing as a cutter, when I do take dips out of the girdle like this, that takes a long time because that's cutting away a lot of material and it's a big facet to polish. And also, as I mentioned, it's cutting away a lot of material. So when you have gems with big cutouts in the girdle, unless there's a major reason for it, like getting rid of a inclusion or something, often it's done more for the sake of design. This will often cost a little bit more per carat because there's more labor and there are fewer carats. So that's just an interesting point. In concave faceting, you can have a semi-classic look. You know, the shape doesn't have to be wild and woolly, or you can have wild and woolly. And so there is a range there depending upon the person's taste. Then there's Cabochon. Cabochon is a very old cutting style, one of the oldest, and it can have a very classic look. This is a very interesting iolite from India that has silver inclusions in it. And Cabochon is good for phenomenal gemstones, like star gemstones, for example. If you don't have a curved surface, you won't have a star. I've had multiple people say, well, why don't you facet a star gemstone? Because you wouldn't have a star. The star is only a star because the surface is curved. And also opals often are not very transparent, but have beautiful play of color, which is often showed off well in a cabochon. One of the disadvantages to cabochons is that they have almost no internal brilliance. They don't sparkle. They are not brilliant. Another thing is they are often included. Now, this is not the fault of the cutting style, but it's just tradition that many times included material will be cut as a cabochon. So whenever you're buying a cabochon, you should look probably a little bit more closely at the clarity. And part of the reason that the cutter often chooses a cabochon for included material may be because the light not being reflected around as much doesn't reflect as many times off the inclusions and show them up as much as it would in a faceted gem. Then we have carving, and carving is also a very ancient style. You know, the Indian Mughals have amazing carved emeralds and things like that. And carving can have a very unique look and texture. The look is defined only by the techniques that the cutter knows and the design he is aiming for. It can have a very wide variety of artistic appearances. These are all ones that I have done, and as such there will be a certain similarity because certain artists tend to have certain looks, but as you can see they are a fairly wide variety because I'm a little bit eclectic in my taste. And also one of my primary goals is using optimally each gem rough. So I allow the rough to dictate to me a lot of what the cut ends up being. Another thing about carvings is sometimes they can be two-sided, like these two pictures are the same gemstone, these aquamarines down below. This is an unheated aquamarine, and I titled it Sydney Symphony. This won a AGTA Cutting Edge Award. But it's got two sides. The one side, this side, I thought looked sort of like the roof of the Sydney Opera House, and this I thought looked like the waves in the harbor. Now, carving is one benefit of carving is it's good for gems with multiple colors because it does not focus all the light and bounce it across from side to side and back and forth and back out. It doesn't mix the color as much in many cases. So like this sunstone, if I had cut this as a flat faceted gem, it would have mixed the green and the red, and it would have been muddy. Green and red makes mud. So that's one of the benefits to carving. It's also good for lightly included gems, like this orange one is a mandarin garnet that was lightly included. Because of all the surface features of the carving, it disguises the inclusions to a certain extent. And also, as I was talking about the faceted stones bouncing the light around tend to reflect the inclusions more than a cabochon or a carving would. So keep that in mind buying carvings. Look at the inclusions, make sure that A, they're not offensive to the eye, and B, they're not located in such a place that it might make it dangerous to set. One of the disadvantages or trade-offs of carving is that the brilliance is variable. I started faceting before I started carving, so when I went into carving, I was still aiming for brilliance. So these carvings of mine, for the most part, have much more brilliance than most gemstones carvings do because I was planning the optics, which is why you see these bright little areas of the gemstone. Whereas like opal has a very low refractive index, in this one I was going much more for surface texture than brilliance, which is normal for a carving. And you can see the white you see is all surface reflection from the lights when we were photographing it. The yellow reflections you see are from the back, but you don't get, excuse me, you don't get nearly as much reflection from the back of a carving as you would for a flat faceted stone. And also another thing to consider if you're buying carvings for jewelry is they can be hard to set. I personally plan, like this has a regular girdle. It's got a girdle almost like a marquise shape, as does this one. This also has little places I plan for the gem to be set. But in many cases, carvings can be a little trickier to set. So you've got to think a goldsmith or consult a goldsmith and consider how this is buying a carving. Then we come to combination or fantasy cuts. Now the AGTA for many years had a combination category, and most other people call them fantasy cuts. Combination, why combination? Because it's a combination of different cutting techniques in a single stone. Fantasy, well, because it's a cool name, and also because it's basically whatever you dream up and have the techniques to do, you can do. Now these are both stones that I cut. You can see that they're quite different from each other. And one of the strongest points of the combination or fantasy cuts is that they can be very unique and artistic. You know, like this stone, I cut it. I've cut many amethysts, and I've never cut an amethyst like that before or after. So people can own a one-of-kind piece of gemstone art. This is also a cool rutilated quartz. This was a red spinel. And the fantasy style of cut or combination cutting is very open to interpretation. It's fascinating when I'm showing these to people at a gem show. I personally call most of these styles I call them my dreamscape cut, because everybody dreams up something different they see in there, and I dreamed up what to do when I cut it. And as people look at them, one person sees champagne, the next person sees planets or stars, next guys sometimes see golf balls if they've got golf on the brain. Or like, to me at least, this one looks like an underwater scene. But everybody sees something different, even in the same gemstone. It's sort of like a Rorschach test, which is those ink dots that psychologists put on paper to see what the person sees, and they use that to interpret what they're thinking or something like that. I'm not a psychologist. But it's fascinating in gemstones to see the wide variety of different interpretations that people have of these different cuts. The only problem is, and some of you may have noticed this already, is that sometimes the interpretation can go wrong. If you can see this amethyst in the middle, I thought I cut this according to the shape of the rough. I thought it was really cool. I finished it up, or was finishing it up, and one of my helpers was saying, you know what? That looks like a coffin. I thought, ooh, it does look like a coffin. And sure enough, it looks like a coffin as far as the shape goes. So that means I had this gemstone for years longer than I otherwise would have had, because I didn't realize I was cutting a coffin until finally I found one of my clients who liked coffins and liked the more somber side of things, and was very happy to have it. But it can be a very cool factor, or it can be a downside. Another thing about combination or fancy cuts is that you can have symmetry, like these gems all are very symmetrical, or you can have asymmetry. And this, another thing I find interesting observing my clients is that some people have what I call symmetrical brains. They just can't figure out what to do. I sell a lot to jewelers. They just can't figure out what to do with a gemstone that isn't symmetrical. But I have other clients, like there's especially this one designer I think of. I can't sell him a symmetrical gem to save my soul. I can't remember him ever buying a symmetrical stone from me. Every time he comes to the show, he searches specifically through my inventory for the asymmetrical gems. So there are some people with asymmetrical aesthetics or design styles, and other people with symmetrical. So combination or fancy cuts can appeal to them both. This one isn't necessarily so asymmetrical, just a really fun conceptual piece I did. It's a combination of a fancy cut with a cabochon with a carving. It's sort of a crossover. It's an aquamarine. It's got carving on the top, carving on the bottom, so you get some brilliance. And it would have been very difficult to set, because you see how steep the ends are and how steep the sides are. So I also put a groove in the side here so somebody could bezel set it. That was a fun piece that I did that was based on the piece of rough to get what I felt was the optimal use for that specific piece. And so one of the fun things about the combination or fancy cuts is there are virtually unlimited possibilities as far as appearance, style, aesthetic, and all of that kind of thing. These are all fancy or combination cuts, all of them done by us. And you can see that even in my own work or our own work, there is a great variety. Another positive thing about many fancy or combination cuts is they can have very good tilt performance. You see this blue topaz is the same gem in both pictures. This is straight on, and this is tilted quite severely. Now the brilliance is a little bit less, but it's not windowing out for the most part. There's just a little bit of windowing here. So the tilt performance can be really good. It's also, as is carving, because often it's a combination of carving and faceting, it's also very good for multicolored gems. You can keep the colors separated many times far better than you could with a regular flat faceted cut. So these are a sampling of multicolored gems, and it shows how the colors keep nicely separated. It's one of my favorite techniques, especially for Oregon sunstone. You get some beautiful sunstones with a fancier combination cutting. Oftentimes, it's not a very traditional look. So there are traditionalists who will not like these cutting styles, although some, like this round, for example, I find these to be sort of a crossover. Many people who have a more traditional taste will like this appearance, even though it is a combination or fancy cut. And these will appeal to people who want something really different, really unique, and aren't afraid to step outside the box. Another thing about fancy cuts, combination cuts, is they will often require a custom setting, just like a carving will. That's another thing about carvings that I didn't mention. But these free forms, you're going to have to make a custom setting for. So you have to factor in that cost. There are, however, some, like these rounds, which might go in a standard finding, but you have to take into consideration the profile and things like that. So I hope you're all still with me. That's all. And thanks so much for listening and being patient and hanging with me.